Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome back. It's been, I don't know, maybe a year since we've recorded a podcast last time, maybe even longer. But my older brother and I are back. We were talking on the phone not too long ago about Christian Twitter logical fallacies that Christians often make against each other. They're not just Twitter fallacies. You could probably just say they're just fallacies in general. They tend to show up more on social media than other places or even in conversation. So we thought we would just touch on some of the main ones that we're seeing in the Christian church today. It is important for us as Christians to think rightly. So we were going to talk a little bit, first of all, we're going to talk about why we need to think well, think logically as Christians. And then after we cover that, we'll touch on some of the common fallacies that we've been observing. And we'll probably run out of time. Or I have to have a part two on this. So without further ado, let me just ask you, Aaron, why do we as Christians, why should we care about logic?
There's a couple of reasons. Number one, we believe in a God who gives us a transcendent, ordered world. So it's reflective of his character. He didn't create a universe of chaos. He didn't create a universe in which we just interpret things on our own. Rather, he gives us an objective reality. He gives us objective truth that's true for everybody everywhere. So it doesn't matter where you're from, what your cultural background is, what your gender is, doesn't matter. It's true for everybody everywhere. And as such, if that's his reality, our thinking should reflect his character and his reality. Christ himself also says similar things when he says that we are to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. Okay. That doesn't mean that we're just going to go along to get along. That doesn't mean that we're supposed to just believe what people tell us. We need to investigate. We need to check things out. And then when you read Luke and you read Paul and you read the scriptures, these aren't people who are just believing things for the sake of it. Luke is investigating eyewitness testimony. Paul is making philosophical and logical arguments. He's disputing with the philosophers of Athens. And so the Christian tradition on this is from scripture and on is very strong, systematic truth that's based on God's objective reality, or as the way Johannes Kepler and others would say, we are thinking God's thoughts after him. And so we can't throw that stuff out at the door because we believe in a God who's objectively true. And so when we start making these fallacies, it just becomes mere opinion. And we believe in something much greater than our mere opinion.
Right. And I think part of it too, for me, is I go to the commandment, do not bear false witness. If we're going to talk truthfully and clearly about specific issues, we need to be careful. Number one, that we're representing what people actually believe. We'll talk about the straw man fallacy probably much later on. But to me, it's one of those things like if I'm going to be presenting something, it needs to be clear. It needs to be well expressed so that I am understood, because I do not want to communicate something I did not intend to communicate. And so part of thinking well about things is that communication aspect of it. If I don't think logically, I don't know how to communicate that. So I'm misunderstood and I might be bearing false witness, which I'd be violating one of our 10 commandments. So that's not a place to be either. So that's one of my things on when it comes towards thinking well. And we are told, just to give you some biblical evidence for this, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So to love the Lord well means that we must think. There's no getting around thinking well. So there is some biblical basis for thinking well. In fact, most people don't think of this, but I think of like Adam and Jesus were probably the smartest people ever. And we often don't think of that. Imagine having all of your faculties of reason without any fallenness. Now, Adam experienced that later, but man, I just think of Jesus and Adam being the smartest people ever.
I think, yeah, no genetic anomalies, no deterioration, no decay. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they would be that smart. It just occurs to me, there's a famous presentation that the apologist Josh McDowell used to make, and it's when he goes through all the prophecies of the Old Testament. And one of the things that he says on this, it's just related to your thinking comment, is he says something along the lines of those arguments against Christianity would be good unless you want to think. And everybody in the world would rather do anything but think. And that's his response. And you're absolutely correct. And that's true of Christians also, is we'd rather just have something handed to us, or we'd rather just regurgitate information, or say, well, I'm a Christian just because it makes me feel good. No, we believe in propositional, historic, transcendent truth. It's not just about your feelings. And so that's where we really need to kind of get into this.
Yeah. And so how do propositions relate to each other is, learning how those connect. You got to use a tool like logic. Otherwise, there's no way to communicate that. So for example, if I say God is one, that's a proposition. And that's from scripture itself. So now, not all of Scripture can be boiled down to propositional truth. There's, of course, narrative that's within there, but it is not less than propositional truth either. Um,
Right. Well, God is one. It's either true, and that's where logic comes. It's either true or it's false.
yeah.
It's not like it's only true for some people. Either there is a single unitary, what Trinitarian, single God, but Trinitarian, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Either that's right or it's wrong. I mean, there's no in between on that when you make that sort of truth claim, right?
Yeah. All right. So let's touch on some of the basics. So there's things in logic, and right, and what that we can talk about. One is what's called formal logic, which is just how do propositions connect to each other and give rise to a conclusion. That's one. That's formal logic. What we're talking about is what's called informal fallacies. So these are fallacies that are regardless of the kind of argument you're building and developing. They're mistakes in reasoning that sound persuasive, but they actually don't really deal with the point or argument at hand. They're often distractions, or they're very poor arguments that just sound persuasive. So so brother, what was one of the? I know we were talking about the genetic fallacy earlier, so go ahead and get us started off with the genetic fallacy. Where are we seeing that in the social media / Christian subculture here?
So the genetic fallacy shows up in a lot of areas. It can show up in the life debate issue on things like abortion or end of life issues like euthanasia. And it also shows up on a lot of these critical theory arguments and stuff like that. And the genetic fallacy basically does something to put it in easy layman terms. It attacks the source of an argument rather than the argument itself. So where I see that, and I use the life example, is you'll often see Christians, and this is, it's not just Christian Twitter, but you'll see things like, well, unless you have a uterus, you're not allowed to say anything. So in other words, unless you have certain equipment or unless you have a certain sex, your argument is therefore invalid. That's a genetic fallacy. You're saying that who's making the argument determines the truth of the argument. That's not the case. It doesn't matter what that person is in terms of their genetics or ethnicity. It's true or it's not true. But that's the genetic fallacy. That's the example that I've seen. What's an example you've seen?
You know, the one that I've seen is, for example, we'll say they'll pick on somebody, say like George Whitefield comes to mind, and because George Whitefield argued for slavery, he was wrong in this other area as well. You know, and so it's kind of going to be borderline ad hominem, but it's also saying, oh, George Whitefield, and then they're going to look back at George Whitefield and try to attack his history, make him sound like a sordid character. And so what he's saying, we don't have to pay attention to because he's a slaveholder.
I like that example, a really silly example, but actually happened in church history a little bit in the 80s and 90s during the so-called worship wars, would say because drums were used in Africa for pagan rituals, therefore all drums are demonic. Right. And so in other words, if you put a drum set in your church, you're therefore inviting demons into your church. That's a genetic fallacy. You're arguing because it was used for one purpose somewhere else, or it has its origins in a pagan place, therefore it's completely irredeemable. So, I mean, that would have been news to Bach when he was using timpani in his Christmas oratorio, but I guess he was being demonic, but that's a really silly example, but that's how these genetic fallacies show up in all kinds of areas.
Yeah, probably the more common one that we're going to probably spend some time on is what we call the ad hominem fallacy. There are various kinds of ad hominem fallacy, but just to define it real quick, it's an argument against the person. That's what ad hominem stands for. And what this does is we're going to ignore the point, ignore the argument, and attack the person. So in various different ways. Some are just straight up in your face attack. So think like name calling. That happens. I mean, you can't talk about Christian Twitter without talking about name calling. Man, all you got to start talking about is all the homophobic, sexist, whatevers that are often thrown out there. And
well, what it really is, I'll give them to you right now. And this is and this is because you and I face this, but we could put anything in there. If you are white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, native born, you don't have anything to say.
Mm.
because you are part of the problem. And so therefore, if you make an argument, I don't have to listen to your argument because you are the power. You are white, cisgender, right? That is a form. It's both ad hominem and part of this genetic fallacy idea. It's the origin of it. And that's where these are kind of cousins, right? These genetic fallacy and ad hominems. But that's where you'll see it. So it's like, well, you're only saying that because you're white, or the way you'll say sounds about white,
Yeah.
or something like that. And that's a dismissal of the argument. You're trying to attack the character of the person rather than the argument itself. It happens in politics all the time. Well, because this person 10 years ago tweeted something stupid, therefore we don't have to listen to that person anymore,
Yeah.
or whatever, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, and this is the abusive part of it. So this is what's called the ad hominem abusive. Would be like, for example, I just was going kind of flipping through as we got ready. John MacArthur's under attack today on Twitter, and progressive Christians are jumping on him, basically calling him, mean and pig-headed, and that's the example of abusive. It doesn't even point to any facts. It's just literally straight up name calling. Um, it's like playground. It's like going
Yeah,
to a
that's not.
playground.
Yeah, that's not even hard to do. I mean, that's a little bit easier to point out. But no, I see. You're right. If just calling somebody, like you said, pig-headed, or calling somebody reactionary. So that's a little bit better, because now you're talking about something that's a little bit more specific. So
Yeah.
pig-headed, like you said, is just kind of schoolyard taunt. You're right. That's just silly.
Yeah.
But some of them are a little bit more. You're just a reactionary. You're just afraid of change,
Yeah.
or you're just you're having tears or fragility because you're uncomfortable right now. Not your argument's not valid. It's just you're having an emotional experience, or you have, like you said before, you have a phobia. There's something psychologically wrong with you. That's the only reason you would disagree with me, because nobody has a valid disagreement. But again, that's all ad hominem in this case.
Yeah. So the next one, and I think you were describing this one earlier, is what's called the ad hominem circumstantial, which is like based upon your circumstances. We don't need to listen to your argument. So, for example, you're only saying that because you're a man, or something along those lines, or you're only saying that because you're a Baptist. So, based upon your circumstances, I should or should not be, should or should not be listening to you. So that's how the circumstantial works. So, for instance, this would be like, say you were arguing, let's go John MacArthur. He's arguing against right now, like he's making a big push. This is how he made it into this conversation. He made a big push for the pulpit this Sunday to be talking about sexual ethics from a Christian perspective, because our brothers in Canada are facing a law which is restricting what they can and can't say about sexual activity. So he's like, you know what, in honor and support of our Christian brothers in Canada, let's preach on sexual ethics this Sunday. And so I think personally that's why he's under attack. But they're basically just saying that because you are because you are a white man who enjoys his privilege, that's the only reason you're saying that. So that's it, based upon MacArthur's circumstances. He's a straight white male. He's wrong.
Right. And he's an American, and he's in a privileged church. His church is wealthy. He's not in that. So not only is he's a privileged person and he's in the wrong place and he's a straight white man, he's even in the wrong country. Right. So, I mean, he has nothing to say because he's an American that's in California. That has nothing to do with. So no, that's a great example of that. And for those who are listening to this or watching this, you should look at that law. That is something to look up. A similar law that's going around right now is happening in Finland also. There's a Finnish bishop who's in a sister synod for me. I'm a Missouri Synod Lutheran, who is under legal prosecution. So if you want to see the results of this, there's a Finnish bishop and a member of the Finnish legislature, who are right now under prosecution. So it's not like something we're making up, like, Christians are, looking for persecution complex, like we're always under attack. No, this is real stuff that's happening legally in different countries. And so MacArthur, by doing this, again, you're hearing this the ad hominem, you're going after him rather than what he's actually doing or actually what he's saying.
Right. And I've heard this too when we talk about like the tax exempt status of, say, churches and like the housing allowance for pastors. And for example, like, well, historically, Anglican churches had a parsonage, and most Protestant churches didn't have the same kind of parsonage. And so there was a housing allowance was given by the tax code in the United States in order to somehow, to benefit the Protestant pastors, like they were receiving a benefit in like Anglican or Episcopal churches that have parsonages. So it was seen to be kind of as let's try to make things more fair and equal for different churches. Well, if I start going through that now, if I start explaining that to somebody who thinks that they need to do away with the, let's say, the housing allowance for pastors, they're going to say, well, you're only saying that because you're self-interested because you're a pastor. I mean, it's the same kind of argument that I'll hear. It's not dealing with anything that I just said. It's like, oh, you're just saying that because you're a pastor and you receive a benefit.
Right. So it's like, yeah, that's a great example. And you see it in the political realm as well, where it's odd because somebody will say, well, you're only saying that because you're getting something out of it. And then people are baffled when people vote in ways they don't understand and say, well, why would people vote against their self-interest?
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. What is it then? Are you supposed to vote for your self-interest, or are you not supposed to vote for your self-interest? So most people are really inconsistent on that even there. But you're right. You're, again, like you said, it's a circumstantial thing. So you're saying, well, because you stand to benefit from the result, therefore you are biased, and therefore I don't have to listen to you, or therefore your argument is invalid. And that's just simply not. So in other words, and the easiest way to say this is, everybody that says 2 + 2 = 4 gets $100. So then if I say 2 + 2 = 4 gets me $100, does that mean it's false because I have a self-interest?
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? So that's one of the reasons we dismiss that. That is absolutely fallacious on its face, but people buy it, or they go on it because people are naturally cynical. We realize that human beings are selfish. We realize that human beings, and that's not wrong, but unfortunately, because we know that, it allows us to dismiss other people and not actually find out what the truth of the argument actually is.
Right. Yeah, and I will side comment here. I think this is where identity politics for the circumstantial has really tied into this. Like, that's why I think this one's exploded. The circumstantial one is because of identity politics. You know, if I can lump you together in some identity markers, then I should or shouldn't listen to you, more or less.
That's why we're going to elevate some voices, and that's what critical theory will say. For those of you who have heard that in the news and stuff, not the caricature of it, not what the legislatures are saying, but actual academic critical theory. You'll hear words like problematizing or elevating and those sort of things. We're going to problematize one voice or one group or one action and elevate another action based on group identity. And therefore, that means the ones that are elevated are allowed to say something, and the ones that have been de-elevated or put down or silenced are not allowed to say something. These are not logical arguments. It has to do with power, is what it really has to do with.
Yeah. All right. So just to cover, we've done ad hominem, abusive, just think blatant name calling, circumstantial, which is a very common one. The third one is another one that's a little more subtle, but it's called the 2QK fallacy, or the U2. What this does is it's like, I'm going to make you sound like a hypocrite. And because you have behaved hypocritically, your argument is valid or you're valid or invalid based upon your own hypocrisy. So I actually did pull up the tweet for this. I'll actually share it, and then I'll go ahead and close out of it. This is just something that I stumbled across on Christian Twitter. So this is by Jared Wilson. I don't really have any bone to pick with Jared Wilson. It's just that it happened to catch my eye. If you're a Baptist and you said nothing about the recent political rally in a prominent Baptist church, maybe consider out of the Anglicans' business. All right, little context on that tweet. There was Donald Trump went to First Baptist Church in Dallas, which is a prominent Baptist church, and it did kind of look like a political rally. And then Beth Moore, who was a former Southern Baptist, now a part of an Anglican church, served communion. And so, a lot of Southern Baptists were looking at the Anglicans, looking at Beth Moore and going, for being a complementarian, you're sure seen to be taking a lot of roles that are reserved for men. And so Wilson, in that environment, now puts that tweet out. In other words, you have to criticize both in order to be able to criticize the one. And so it's fallacious because I don't have to criticize everything in order to criticize that one thing. And so this is just saying I'm a hypocrite if I only criticize Anglicans, but I don't criticize Baptists.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of that. And you see this, and again, it's not just limited to the theological realm. That's a great theological argument for that. But it's similar, the stuff that we just experienced. And another example would be the stuff involving the January 6th stuff. Because there are people waving Christian flags, right, at the storming of the Capitol and the riot and stuff like that. And I've yet to meet anybody that thinks that was a good thing. I mean, I haven't met anybody that said that was a good thing. But they're waving flags, and there's Christian. And so now it's like, unless you condemn Christian nationalism, you're not allowed to speak on this issue. Right. Yeah. And so in other words, you must do X in order to not be Y. And that's simply not how arguments work. That's not the topic at hand. No person is going to be well versed. And that's part of it is you're not giving the benefit of the doubt to the person you're having a discussion with. Maybe they haven't read up on something. Maybe they don't have an interest in it. Maybe they just simply are ignorant. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people might not make a comment on certain things, but we've gotten to such a politicized environment that even in the church, unless you say, I reject Christian nationalism, you're not allowed to talk about something like pro-life issues. Or unless you reject Christian nationalism, you're not allowed to speak on things like religious liberty. It's really strange, but for some reason we think that that's an effective way of debate. And I think part of the reason is again, we've grown up in this media environment and this cultural environment with social media. And I'm glad you use Twitter, because Twitter's example A of this, because you have 150 characters or less. So you want to just, let's get my soundbite in, like, let's zap that person and say, oh, I called you out. I did my thing. I won. I dunked on you. And since I dunked on you, therefore, that has nothing to do with it. That's not an argument. And that's why I don't think anybody's ever been persuaded by Twitter or a Facebook feed. Nobody's ever been persuaded. So then the next question would be, of course, and this isn't a fallacy, but what are we wasting our time on?
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother argument. But I'll turn it back over to you here.
Yeah, the example I was going to give for the QQK fallacy, the U2 fallacy, was actually had to do with the pro-life position. And I've seen this come up where you say, for example, as a conservative pro-lifer, you might just say, like, I believe that life begins at conception. We ought to protect said life. We ought to overturn Roe v. Wade and so on. And the progressive Christian often looks at the conservative Christian and goes, well, if you were really pro-life, what you would be for would be like social justice programs and universal health care and universal pre-K and so on. If you're really pro-life, that means from birth to grave. And so it's almost like they're trying to redefine what it means to be pro-life. That's honestly, that's what they're doing. But they think like, oh, you're hypocritical. You don't really care about life. You only care about that particular kind of life.
Or a conspiracy theory, you only care about controlling women. That will be the one that you're going to kind of get out of there. In other words, unless you approve of these, and this is, again, we're trying to avoid being partisan. This isn't a political thing, but it's related because this comes from Christians, is like you just said, unless you support not only universal health care, but unless, another way this is often put it, unless you're going to adopt all those babies, you therefore should be pro-choice. Right. That's another way that'll be said. Unless you're willing to open your house, unless you have a bunch of foster kids at home, you don't have, you're being a hypocrite because you're not really pro-life. Or, and here's another one, unless you're against the death penalty, then you're not really pro-life. That's another one that'll come up in these discussions. And again, that's not the issue, but it's a way of, like you're saying, this tu quoque, it's making you look like that you're hypocritical. So therefore I can dismiss the argument. But the right to life has nothing to do with the death penalty. But you can't do that because then you're actually going to have that debate. So instead, let's dismiss it and attack something else. And in this case, make you look like a hypocrite. I think that's a great point. And you do see it. I think you're right on the life issue in particular, but also in the political realm when it comes to like, who do I virtue signal to online? Like you brought up the First Baptist of Dallas. In both cases, it's a very obvious fallacy, but people fall for it and they use it again to dunk on people. It's to dunk on people. The whole purpose is to silence people.
Yeah. And we're kind of running out of time here. We'll have to shut this down soon. But the key thing with any ad hominem is we're going to ignore the argument and attack the person. So these are just examples of it. So you have the circumstantial, you have the abusive, and you have the U2, the U2 fallacy, the 2K. The point is, I'm ignoring what you're saying. I'm ignoring what we're supposed to be talking about, and I'm going after you. And that's what ad hominems do, is they have nothing to do with the argument itself, but they have to do with the person, which honestly, it moves out of, this is, to me, it's actually not just logically fallacious. To me, it's actually sinful when you do this thing, because what you're doing is you're not having communication in a spirit of love, but instead it's a spirit of attack. So to me, it's not just logically wrong, but it's also sinful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, what kind of witness are you bearing in that case, right? If you're a disciple of Christ, He says, again, as I said, be wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. When you're attacking somebody's origins, or you're attacking somebody's, circumstance, or trying to point out that they need to say this or say X, you're not giving them the benefit of the doubt. You're not putting the best foot forward. You're not showing love and care for that individual. You're instead basically saying, I can dismiss you or not take you seriously because I have this agenda, or because I don't want to address the argument, or I think I'm already right, or whatever the argument is. And a lot of the time, we're just wanting to have a discussion. The Reformed pastor, Vodi Bakum, points that out. We've gotten to the point now where even having a debate is evidence of your guilt.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, well, the fact that you even disagree with me, I just told you that this is true. And the fact there's got to be something wrong with you. And instead of actually convincing you with evidence or with logic or whatever it is, I'm going to just dismiss you completely just because you said that there even is a debate. And so we're not even having a discussion anymore, right? And Christians should be better than this. We should be leading by example, not just going with the flow and whatever the rest of the world is doing. We need to lead by example and be better, as opposed to just jumping on board and dunking on other Christians because somebody didn't virtue signal the way I wanted you to.
Yeah, and I would say this is just my perspective. I don't remember who said this. I read it somewhere, and I think this is a good description of what goes on a lot of social media platforms right now, because unless you've been living under a rock, that social media leans left. That's their bend, is they lean left. And so what you'll find is that it's what you're supposed to do is criticize the right and kiss the left. That's the rule. That's the unspoken rule that you're supposed to do on the social media platforms. And so if you don't follow that unspoken rule, that's when you fall under the whims and critique and the I guess the maliciousness of the social media overlords, is when you don't follow that unspoken rule. You're muted.
Yep, sorry. I think there's truth in that. I almost made it the whole time without making the Zoom faux pas. There's truth in what you're saying there too. I think if you realize the platform in which you're using, and I think if the platform is inherently flawed, the medium does become the message. That's a line from Neil Postman in his book in the 1980s, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is an unrelated topic, but I think it carries over here, where the medium is the message. So if your medium is inherently designed to push a certain narrative, then you're probably going to lose at the outset at some point, right? It doesn't mean that you can't never engage. It doesn't mean that you have to jump off, or that you're not going to be informed, and it doesn't mean any of that. But it does mean that platform is a thing. And so you have to be aware going in at what that is. And unfortunately, too many Christians have been sucked into that apparatus and are now kind of feeding the monster, right? And kind of feeding this sort of thing and using logical fallacies to boot while they do it.
Yeah, that's good. And like I said, we're gonna have to do part 2, because we just covered 2 fallacies.
Indeed.
Yeah,
I want to do we got to do red herring. We got to do category errors. We got a whole bunch to do. We got to do a bunch.
Yeah. So we'll come back and do some more. So I guess hopefully the next couple of weeks we'll get another episode up. You'll go get that. We'll have some more tweets and examples where you guys can find these out. Let us know. I think the comments are open. So let us know what fallacies that you may have encountered on this video or feed. So be curious.
Indeed, Andrew and I are usually plugged in, and so we can respond, and we can jointly respond, and we can respond to each other, and we've done it before. So by all means, if this is posted, whether you see it on a Facebook or on YouTube or whatever it is that this gets posted, we are usually pretty rapid in those responses, or like you said, we can address it in a future video podcast or something like that.
Yeah, sorry, this is just the facetious side of me. All right, let's have a bet. How long is it going to take for us to go, you classified that fallacy wrong, therefore your whole video was wrong,
right.
To criticize those particular
right. Or logic, or only people that argue for logic and evidence only do so because they're from a position of privilege. That's the other one, right? The only reason you care about logic and evidence is because you're privileged. That's not the real reason. The real reason is because you don't want to hear these stories because they make you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
See, that'll be the other one. I'm waiting for that one. That's the one that I always like to see.
Yeah. So I guess I'll give it 2 or 3 days, maybe. We'll see. Maybe we might make it. We might make it without that kind of criticism. We'll see. So anyway, if you've watched this long, thanks so much, and God bless you guys, and learn how to think well. Encourage you to think carefully. Don't just post the first thing that pops in your head. It's not going to be the right thing to do.
Correct. See you later.
Yeah. Thanks, bro.